Hey guys, it's Sam, and this is my spoiler-free review for The Grace of Kings by Ken Liu. This is the first book in what's called a silk punk fantasy series. This is an adult fantasy series that is following a ton of different characters. You could argue that there's like maybe two main characters, but not really, which I will get to. This book just is basically covering a bunch of different characters that are all involved with a conflict that arises after I forget how many years of peace. Quite a while, maybe like 30 years or so of peace. Maybe it's more like 20. But this takes place on this archipelago that used to be 7 kingdoms, and then there was one emperor that came in and basically united all the kingdoms and kind of colonized all the kingdoms and brought them all together for peace. And then that peace is shattered, and we follow the start of that unfolding and who some of the major players are, and there's a ton of major players in this political conflict. And we just follow this probably another 20-year time span-ish of all of this political unrest and who's going to come out on top now that this facade of peace was shattered. So I initially tried to read this book back, I think in 2020, maybe 2021, and I had gotten 140 pages into it and forgotten nearly everything. So when I picked it back up again, I was like, I'm going to give it a second go. And then I actually was getting my tattoo done that I got done recently. I have a large thigh tattoo now. And I read the 140 pages again during the tattoo and stopped at almost the exact same point. And I was like, I could stop again. But I pushed through because so many people love this series. And this is a quartet, I believe it's 4 books total. And a lot of people really love it. So I was like, let's see how I feel. So first off, we'll talk about the world building. Because this is silk punk, this is a reimagining of the Han Dynasty, the founding of the Han Dynasty. And so it's like that, and then it has that, I guess that punk element is that there's some, steampunky adjacent things about, the warfare, and there's, airships and things like that, and just, what the technology is in this, although I wouldn't say the technology is, the biggest thing. This is very much a military fantasy, in this first book at least. So as far as the world building, I liked being in a fantasy setting that is not your typical medieval, European setting. And this did have the existence of gods and gods meddling. And honestly, I could use more of the gods meddling. The chapters with the gods doing things, even though they're not supposed to meddle, I love a story where gods are meddling and they're not supposed to and they're finding ways around it. Anytime the gods appeared, that was really great because there's gods of each one of those sort of 7 kingdoms. And so having them kind of be well, we have a stake in this too because these are our people and everything like that, I always dig that a lot. And I would have liked to have seen more of the day-to-day of this world and of this society. Again, this is so heavily military fantasy. And not in a way that I think is obvious from the synopsis. The synopsis really makes it seem like you're following 2 characters primarily, and you are not. And I read a lot of books that involve war. A lot of fantasy books involve war. And this one was probably one of the most heavily war-focused books that I have read that didn't necessarily have a lot of the little character moments in the same way. But let me get to that with the characters. So as I mentioned, there are so many characters. There are primarily 2 that I would say that we follow. One is this man who kind of grew up as a little bit of a gangster. He has his rise to fame a little bit as a gangster, and then is just this commoner that rises into power, not even by his own trying. He's just very charismatic and he's a decent leader. And then we had this other man who is from a noble house that was the whole house basically was killed by the emperor that took over, and so he has a vendetta, but he also feels like he has a place of leadership. I would say those are our 2 major forces, but there's so many other side characters. So as the rebellion starts happening, there are so many characters who are taking places of power within it. There are so many different advisors. There's so many smaller characters that come in and out. So this is almost a series of character vignettes in a lot of ways, because there's so many characters who play even a pretty important role in what's happening that we only get a sliver from. Some of those being women, by the way, which I think that improves as the series goes on from what I've heard, but women do feel a little bit sidelined in this story. And yeah, it just was we were jumping characters so much that it felt, someone in my Discord actually said this, that this first book at least feels more like a prologue than it does its own story. This sets up a lot. And so and even the first parts of the book, you're just was this whole thing a giant prologue? So as far as characters, I don't feel any particular attachment to any of the characters. I do kind of one of the main characters and his wife, and their dynamic is very interesting, and I think we will follow them potentially, or something about them in later books, maybe, but I don't have any real attachment, like, to any of these characters, and that is a bit of a bummer. Like, they just felt like chess pieces on a chessboard, because that's kind of what they were, and I think there's part of that was intentional, because it is sort of like, these people, there's so many of them all tied up in this thing. But yeah, there were some moments of some of these like character things, but I would have liked to have felt like I knew these people more than I feel like I did. Lastly, we talk about the plot. As I mentioned, military fantasy. It's all just a series of like moving pieces. It's all like who is contending for power where, how are they trying to get it, how are they trying to outmaneuver. There's a lot of miscommunication that happens, like military political miscommunication, and that can be really frustrating. And yeah, so it's all just like watching a series of like over a very big span of time and of land and things and lots of different people, who's winning, who's moving, what's happening, how are they outmaneuvering. There is some really fun like sort of strategy things that happen in here too that you're like, is this going to work? And then it does, and you're like, wow. But yeah, so like, and things that kind of like tie back in, but ultimately this felt like kind of like an epic tale of a war more than any like following a certain set of characters, really. So based on the end of this book, I kind of feel like this was the setup for like, and now what? But yeah, I'm feeling a little torn about this book. I do think that it was like a well-written undertaking potentially, but like nothing's super motivating me to keep reading. I think it's like a 3-star for me. Like, I didn't hate it, but I'm gonna find it pretty forgettable. So asking people who've read this series, the whole series ideally, does the style of this change in later books? Do you actually get like close to the characters in later books, or is it all just political maneuvering the whole time? Because I need character closeness and like character like depth to the characters and the interactions and all the complexities more than I just need chess pieces moving on a board, you know? So let me know, because right now I'm very torn about reading this. I could totally not, or I could be convinced. We'll see. So yeah, those are my thoughts on The Grace of Kings by Ken Liu. Comment below and let me know your thoughts on this book. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys soon. Bye.